I would love to take some questions. And as mentioned, we've got a little extra incentive, which is the first 5 people who line up at the mics for a question, they're going to get a free copy of one of my books. Now I know some folks are going to head out. I would argue that your fellow students are going to be asking some good questions. That it's pretty disrespectful to them to cut and run. I mean, if you have to go to the bathroom or something, that's one thing. But, you know, listen to their questions, because they're going to be good questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, we'll go, I'm left-handed, so we'll go left, right, left. And then in terms of the books, come over afterwards. And if you weren't the 5th person, you know, come over and we'll slide the price or we'll work something out. Over there.
All right, so at the beginning, you were talking about how it is that people don't really give themselves permission to be active.
Yes.
How do you convince them to give themselves the permission?
Well, it's a great question. So, you know, how do we give ourselves permission to act? And I think the way we do it is literally by doing that. By jumping in and saying, okay, we don't know how things are going to turn out. You never do. We don't know how we're going to be at it. You never do. Well, maybe if we've done it for a while, we do. But at the beginning, we don't. We're going to take that leap. And the interesting thing is, I mean, there's a woman I profile who had an 8th grade education, dropped out of school in San Antonio, ends up testifying before the US Congress. And she said the people who got me, she's involved in a local community group, she said the people who got me involved, they found a strength that I didn't know I had. You know, skills, confidence, voice. Angie didn't know her, you know, the young woman at Virginia Tech. She didn't know her strengths until she tested them. So what I would argue is you jump in, and then you see what happens, and you learn as you go. You're going to make mistakes. I mean, everybody does. I've made mistakes in every project I've ever been part of, and you learn from them, and you keep on. And then the odd thing is somebody's going to say to you 6 months in or a year in, well, you're so confident, you're so experienced, if I know as much as you do, I could act, but here I am. And then you have to say to them, yeah, but look where I was 6 months ago.
I'm curious, how do you avoid partisanship on college campuses where there's typically, at least stereotypically, there's a liberal bias? How do you avoid non-partisanship in promoting campus activism?
Right. Well, it's something we wrestle with a lot because, you know, it's there in our mission and it's there in the challenge we have to take on. So what I do, you know, and this is something I thought about, is that to me the school needs to be, the phrase I use is a commons. It has to be open to every single student to encourage every student's participation. And at some schools, that participation is going to be 80-20 Democratic. At some schools, it's going to be 80-20 Republican, you know, or 90-10, you know. And at some schools, it's going to be everywhere in between. And so what I would argue is that it's not, the school doesn't have the responsibility to say, okay, in fact, it'd be a really bad idea to damp students' views. We want to encourage the students' views. But what we want to do is to bend over backwards to welcome them. I would actually argue that even if faculty has a strong view, it's okay to express it, but if you do, you then have to, you know, bend over backwards 20 times to make sure that that student in your class who differs with that view, that they're supported, they're encouraged, you know, you're saying to them, yeah, they have a great view, please listen to them, that they're treated with respect, and you know, then I think it works really well. I mean, I have an example that as a student, I was a professor at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, who was he was quite politically liberal, and students knew that. They, you know, he described the kinds of things he was involved in the community. And I was talking to the head of the campus, Young Republicans, and the student said, the professor's name was Glenn, he said, you know, if you took 100 issues, Glenn and I wouldn't agree on 98 of them. We just have different values, that's the way it is. He said, Glenn is absolutely my favorite teacher, and he's inspired me again and again because of his passion, and we agree to disagree on the issues. So to me, that was a great model, because here you had a student and professor, they didn't agree on the issues, they didn't happen to change each other's mind, but they obviously treated each other with respect, with dignity, you know, I would say even with, you know, affectionate friendship. And that's a cool model, because what it says is you know, everyone in that class feels respected. Now, if you had a situation where, say in a class, or just as a school as a whole, a student whose views differed was not respected, I don't think that would be a very good learning situation. You know, because they're part of the campus community, and they need to feel respected. So what I would argue that the challenge is, I mean, what we do is, we distribute nonpartisan voting guides. Here's the issues. Students, you guys make up your mind. Some of you are going to cancel each other's votes out. That's fine. Some of you are going to cancel each other's volunteering out. That's fine, but we want all of you as much as possible to be involved. So, and if I look at our advisory board, we've got it, we're all across the political spectrum in terms of our advisory board, and that was very deliberate because I wanted input from different people who didn't all think exactly the same way. So to me, that's how I think schools handle it, is institutionally. A school, it's just not appropriate for a school to make an institutional say, we are backing this candidate, whether it be president or city council. But to educate their students on the issues, to help them to register, that's, helping them ready. A lot of states, there's these really challenging new voter ID laws. Help the students to register on those laws. And if the students are being disenfranchised, I think it's okay to say, this is not right that our students are being disenfranchised by these laws. But in terms of the candidates, you got to leave it up to the students.
It seems as though it's easier to mobilize citizens around controversial issues that people easily become passionate about, like sexuality, contraception, abortion, and xenophobia. But we still have what I would argue more important issues to deal with, like hunger and homelessness.
Right.
Do you know how we can begin to mobilize people around love and compassion for others instead of hatred and ignorance?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like the guy Rich Cizik from the National Association of Evangelicals, he said that one of the things that made it easier for him, because he got a lot of heat. I mean, like the people focused on the family were demanding his firing and stuff. He said he had worked with people who were, he considers himself a conservative. So he'd worked with people who were more liberal on hunger issues before. And so they were joining across political lines. And I think what you have to do is you have to have a conversation. And you have to say there are issues that we disagree on. I have an example in my book where Christian Coalition's very conservative group, Move On is a very liberal group. They ended up meeting at a conference, becoming friends, a couple of their leaders, and then they worked together on internet neutrality because they both agreed that that was really important. So, on any issue, I think the challenge is to tell the story first. So you make it real. It's abstract. Like on hunger, I like what Oxfam does with their hunger. They have these things called hunger banquets, where basically people divide randomly into different groups based on the percentages of people in the world of what they're going to eat. So one tiny group gets just like, your lavish meal. A fairly large group gets nothing, or maybe water. And then this group in the middle gets like beans, or beans and rice. And it really brings it home to people because, like, wait a moment, how come they're getting this and I'm getting this? So that's actually the way it is in the world. So it's thinking of creative ways to tell the story. And again, one of the things very interesting is that when you reach out on different issues, you'll get people who may vehemently disagree on one issue, but work passionately together on other issues. Cizik and I happen to still be on different sides of the abortion issue. That doesn't stop his being one of my huge heroes and a friend and everything else. We just happen to disagree on one particular issue, and that's life. So I think that when we can do that, it becomes very, very powerful. And we're reaching out, and sometimes people's views change also on the issues we're differing with, and sometimes they don't. But at any point, the more you can talk with each other, and the more you can get the story out on those issues where people really may have, like hunger or poverty, a common response, and then they get them to see that it's real, that it's urgent, that we need to do something about it. Why? Because first response is going to be, oh, you can't do anything about it. You say, well, actually, that's not true. Here are these initiatives. If we actually, I think that the analog is a group called Results. That's a grassroots, nonpartisan hunger lobby. And, they said, if you took the amount of money, I think it's half the money that Americans spent on pet food every year, you basically could stop hunger-related deaths in pretty much most of the world. And I know I like dogs as much as the rest of the person, but it's not that the money isn't there, it's that we don't make it a priority globally or as a country or in our local community. So I think the challenge is just letting people know on that.
As an education major, I was just wondering how you suggest or what your perspective is on how we can teach the process rather than just the conclusion of history, especially to the younger grades.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question, and I think the challenge is you want to basically tell them those stories. I mean, so there is a Rosa Parks book that is aimed at a third grade reading level for 8-year-olds. Like, I got it from my stepson. And it gives you the basic story. So I think that there are resources out there that are absolutely there. I mean, they're really, I would argue, I don't know if people saw the movie or read the book Hunger Games. I would argue Hunger Games is a really powerful moral document. I love the view that they have. It's everyone against each other versus compassion. That's a young adult novel. So there's a lot of resources.
Has there been a moment or event in your life where you first realized you were passionate about these topics, and if so, when?
Well,
what was it?
Yeah, I think I grew into it, but there were two influencers. One was a social studies teacher, apropos of the last question, when I was in high school, who was really outspoken and got us thinking. And then the other was a rabbi who I'm still friends with. And I was 15 and he gave a talk. It was right after the war that Israel took over the occupied territories, and everyone was cheering because our team won. And he was offering some cautions and saying, you know what, this is going to be more complicated. And I remember I could see the audience physically just like bracing, and they were not happy. But I thought it was a really important statement, and it inspired me to take risks. And years later, I asked him, I said, I'm sure you don't remember it. And he said, oh yeah, I remember that talk. I knew I was going to catch grief for it, but he said if I was going to take my vocation seriously, I had to.
You talk about citizenship on a more global level and within the community and politically and economically, but how do you think family obligations play into being a good citizen?
Well, I think youth and family obligation mean like one's own family. Yeah, I mean, I think, children follow the model that you set. So if you from the very beginning are taking them to a community meeting or a political thing, then you sort of see this is what people do. And if it's a foreign world, they're going to be mistrustful. I mean, I remember some friends of mine who are real politically active. There was the garbage didn't get delivered, and they're like, oh, what are we going to do? Oh, it didn't get picked up. And they were debating what to do, and their kid, 4-year-old pipes up, oh, why don't you call the city council? And they're like, yeah, I guess we should. Clearly she had learned that if something is a problem, you go call the city council. You don't just sort of wait on it. So I thought that was a really great model. I just think the more models you set for them, the more likely they are to be able to act.
How do the arts fit into a role of being an active citizen? I am a music major, and so how would I know that in schools, music and other art programs are being cut, and so how do art? I think arts are really important. I mean, they express imagination. I mean, they're a way of making something visual on a level that you can't do it, or your ears hear it. Or I mean, why do people sing at a march in the Civil Rights Movement? Because those songs live. I mean, there's a little story in Possible about the Civil Rights Movement. Their songs, and the songs would keep you going in jail. They lift your spirit. So I would say the arts are hugely important. And then you just figure out creative ways, because artists are creative, to be able to do something.
Types of issues which are very unpopular from both sides of the political spectrum, but they're still very big issues, like things of unions that still need to be there so people can get them, but it's very unpopular from both sides. Yeah. How do we get behind that in a way that is both nonpartisan, but it can still bring in people who believe in both sides?
Well, I think you tell the story. I mean, I'm somebody who believes that unions still have a really important role to play because they give a common voice at work. And maybe that makes me a liberal, but I just know from experience. I've worked with people in union. If you have no union in an environment and your company is doing something unethical, you usually won't speak out because you're going to be fired. If you have a union, you're much more likely to speak out. Say they're dumping something that affects the surrounding community. So there's all sorts of subtle ways that I would argue that they benefit people. And to me, if you're a union activist, you have to make this case. You have to tell people the story, because the story they may know is one that sort of says, oh, well, maybe 80 years ago they were useful and now they're just greedy and whatever. You have to tell them, whatever the issue is. It's no different than the hunger stuff. You have to tell the story.
You propose that in order to be a good citizen, one should work for positive change within the community. However, throughout history, there have been examples of groups that have started with initial positive change, but that have, by our standards, committed crimes against humanity. Some of these groups would be Al-Qaeda or the National Socialist Movement in 1930s Germany. So I guess my question would be, where should we as a society draw the line between positive action and a negative end, and where should we decide where a conflict is excessive or necessary in order to reach our goal?
Yeah, no, very good question. I mean, I would say positive change. I'm not, less sure where they were, but clearly social movements can exist that have negative, very negative ends. I would say there's two elements. One is constantly saying, well, what are the goals? Are the goals appropriate? So, if I look at Al-Qaeda, some of the things that they're talking about are not necessarily bad things, but their means of acting are horrible and inappropriate. If I look at the Nazis, both the goals and the means are horrible. And so what I would argue is, I would have, to me, nonviolence would be the absolute standard, which is, and, I'm not an absolute pacifist, and, the Civil War, the American Revolution, but fact is, if you're in a citizen movement, at least certainly here in the United States, you have no, to risk injuring somebody, killing them, you have to draw that line. I would even argue that property damage is pretty problematic because it creates a culture of fear, and so you just have to set that standard, whatever your goals are and how worthy you think that they are. You just can't risk catching people up in the crossfire. And then there's sometimes movements, the Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, where the goals are very ignoble, to use the word, and you have to challenge that and say, this is not the vision of a good, just society. This is an unjust society, and you have to be able to challenge that. So, I'd say both elements come into play.
As a growing geoscientist, I'm just curious to hear your opinion in terms of environmental issues we face as a global community, and as the U.S. as one of the leading countries in GHG emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. Do you think that the U.S. role of the citizen lacks that factor of the multiplication of courage to reduce destructive habits which contribute to global climate change?
I do. I just think we need more courage all the way up and down the ladder. I'll give you some examples. I'm not going to name the name because it would put sizing difficult. One of the leaders of one of the largest conservative denominations in the country, after Rich Cizik told him about climate change and talked to him, said, well, you may be right, but I don't think my constituents would let me go there. This guy considers himself a Christian. So he's not saying, I'm following Lord where you lead. He's saying, it's politically not expedient, even if it's a disaster for the planet. So yeah, we need courage. And again, I look at the two candidates. They could have been talking about it all summer. And instead, Romney was running away from it during the primaries, running away from his early stand because he wanted to appease the Tea Party, and then trying to sort of tack back to sort of say, well, I actually am moderate on it. And Obama, who actually has done more on renewable energy than any president we've had, was not talking about that because, some pollster said it's not going to poll well. So, yeah, we need more courage there, but you can't wait for that. If there was a movement that was stronger, pushing for it, both of them would. In fact, you saw this with the Keystone Pipeline, where suddenly you had, the Republican governor of Nebraska putting on the brakes, Obama putting on the brakes to look at it further. And that was because people were lining up at the White House in their Obama gear saying, look, don't just roll this through because the tar sands is 4 times as dirty in carbon impact as conventional fuels, and we don't want to facilitate it, we want to put the brakes on it. So I think on this issue, above all, it takes a multiplication of courage, and we just have not. It's not to say we haven't had some. Rich Cizik, hugely courageous. My mayor started a campaign of mayors to take responsibility that has 300 or 400 cities rolled in, including Democrats and Republicans both. But do we need more courage on it? Yeah, we do, because we're not there yet. And we are the biggest, people sort of blame China, but the fact is part of that China imprint is our manufacturing plants that are over there. So you kind of have to count that on both sides. And China's actually moving ahead on renewables way faster than we are. They're also doing stuff with coal that we don't like, but if we actually would lead on it, the impact on the rest of the world is huge. And we need to. And on a practical side, it also will benefit us economically. I interviewed the Danish energy minister who helped spur their renewable. They now have 27% of wind energy. And he described this company called Vestas, and it was 2 steps above a blacksmith shop. It was tiny, farm equipment company. They passed laws to tax energy and roll the money back into subsidies to buy renewable energy. Vestas is the biggest wind turbine producer in the world. It's the biggest export company in Denmark. What they did to do the right thing benefited them economically as well. And we have to do that too. Thanks.